what if everything we've been taught about world peace is just, mathematically backwards?
Oh, totally. I mean, think about how we usually frame the concept of peace when we talk about global discourse.
Right. We treat it like this moral virtue, like a philosophical ideal.
Exactly. It's something that, good, enlightened people are supposed to strive for.
Yeah, but ultimately it's treated as a soft concept.
Hmm.
Because when push comes to shove, we just fall back on the hard sciences of geopolitics.
Oh, absolutely. We fall back on deterrence or zero-sum resource extraction.
Kinetic military action.
Right. We treat physical violence as the fundamental reality of the world.
And peace is just seen as this, fragile, temporary suspension of that violence.
Which is really the dominant paradigm of international relations. We look at the world through this lens of structural realism.
Meaning we assume that human coexistence is just inherently anarchic.
Yeah, and that security can really only be guaranteed through force, or at least, the threat of force.
But the source material we are diving into today completely inverts that entire paradigm.
It really does. It flips it on its head.
So we're looking at a document today called the Peaceful World Manifesto version 1.0. Specifically the public academic version.
Right.
And for you listening, we're doing something highly, highly concentrated today. We're not summarizing the entire manifesto.
Yeah, not at all. That would take days.
Right. Instead, we are putting a microscope entirely over one single paragraph, point 3.
Which is titled, The Law of Interconnection.
With the subtitle, The Systemic Principle.
And honestly, this one paragraph is arguably the theoretical engine of the whole document.
Why do you say that?
Well, because point 3 attempts to strip peace of all its moralistic framing. It reconstructs it as a hard-coded scientific law of the universe.
Wow.
Yeah, it argues that violence isn't just an ethical failure, it's actually a mathematical and biological error in how complex systems function.
So if you violate this systemic principle.
The system physically degrades.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Man, and what makes this paragraph so incredibly dense is that it pulls from, evolutionary biology, cybernetics, game theory.
Nonlinear dynamics.
Yeah, all of it, just to make this case. So our roadmap for this deep dive is to isolate each of these scientific claims one by one.
It's quite a journey.
It is. We're going to look at the architecture of reality through what they call autopoiesis. We'll analyze the physical mechanisms of recursive causality.
Right, and then we'll get into the game theory of coexistence.
And finally, look at how the Manifesto grounds all of this in Earth system science and the Gaia hypothesis.
It's basically asking us to just throw away our 17th century mechanistic view of the world.
And replace it with a 21st century understanding of complex adaptive systems.
Exactly.
Okay, let's start exactly there. With the architecture of reality. The very first sentence of point 3 says, and I quote, "The world is a complex adaptive system possessing the property of autopoiesis, self-creation." So in systems theory, the distinction between a complicated system and a complex system, that's not just semantics, is it?
Oh, no. It's fundamental. It changes how you can even interact with the system itself.
How so?
Well, it changes everything about prediction and control. So think of a traditional complicated system, like a mechanical watch or a commercial airliner.
Okay, lots of parts.
Right. It might have 10 million individual parts, but those parts interact in entirely linear, predictable ways.
So if you understand the physics of every gear.
Or every microchip, yeah.
Yeah.
You can predict exactly what the whole machine will do.
And if a gear breaks, you just diagnose it, take it out, and replace it.
Exactly. The system is static. Its parts are basically ignorant of the whole.
But I mean, human societies and global economies.
Biological ecosystems.
Right. They don't behave like watches.
Not at all, because they are complex adaptive systems.
So what's the difference there?
In a complex system, the individual agents, whether those are cells or people or nations, they are constantly learning.
They're adapting.
Yes. They're adapting and reacting to the behaviors of the other agents. So the whole is not just the sum of its parts.
It's more like an emergent property.
Exactly, an emergent property of the interactions between those parts. You literally cannot understand a complex system by taking it apart.
Because the moment you isolate a variable,
it stops acting the way it did inside the network.
Okay, let's unpack this, because I think this is where our geopolitical models just frequently completely fail.
Oh, constantly.
We approach, a regional conflict or an economic crisis with this mechanical mindset.
Right. We think it's a watch.
Yes. We assume we can introduce a massive kinetic shock, like a military intervention.
Or sweeping economic sanctions.
Yeah. And we think we're going to get a linear, predictable outcome. We treat the target nation like a broken gear we can just rip out or isolate.
But the system adapts. It always adapts. The targeted entities, they route around the sanctions. They form new alliances.
They develop entirely new economic biomes.
Exactly. The intervention itself actually changes the initial conditions of the entire global network.
Wow. And that brings us to that second critical term in the first sentence. Autopoiesis.
Ah, yes.
It says the world possesses the property of autopoiesis, self-creation.
This is such a fascinating concept. It originated back in the 1970s with two Chilean biologists.
Humberto Maturana and Francisco Varela.
That's right. They were trying to answer what seems like a deceptively simple question, like what exactly defines a living system?
Right. How's a biological cell different from a machine?
Exactly. Because a machine is allopoietic.
Meaning?
It produces something other than itself. A factory takes in steel and outputs cars.
But a living cell's primary output is itself.
You got it. A cell is this closed, self-referential network of chemical processes. It's continuously regenerating its own components.
While maintaining its own boundary, like the cell membrane.
Right. It's constantly turning over its material, but it maintains its pattern, its identity. It is engaged in self-creation.
So Maturana and Varela basically argued that autopoiesis is the defining characteristic of life.
Yes.
And the Manifesto is scaling this biological concept all the way up to a planetary level.
It's a massive leap, but it makes sense structurally. It's arguing that the world, the entire biosphere, and all the human societies inside it is an autopoietic system.
So it's continuously recreating itself through the interactions of its parts.
Exactly, and that completely collapses the whole idea of an outside observer, or an isolated variable.
Right, because in a mechanistic worldview, you can stand outside the machine, hold the wrench, and just fix it.
But in an autopoietic system, you are the machinery. You are the chemical process.
Man, that's heavy. So treating the world like a simple machine is literally a fatal error.
It is.
It's not a car engine where you swap out a spark plug.
Yeah.
I'm thinking it's more like a sourdough starter.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Right. Like the yeast and the bacteria are constantly interacting and they're changing the dough from the inside out. You can't just violently remove one part of a sourdough starter without fundamentally altering the chemical makeup of the whole thing.
That's exactly how autopoiesis works.
But wait, calling the world a unified, self-creating cell implies a level of systemic coordination that, frankly, just doesn't seem to exist in human politics.
I see where you're going with this.
I mean, we have 8 billion competing human beings, hundreds of sovereign states, radically different ideologies. How can the Manifesto apply a biological cellular framework to something as fractured and combative as human civilization?
Well, because autopoiesis doesn't actually require ideological harmony.
It doesn't.
No, it only requires systemic interdependence. Think about it. Your own body contains trillions of bacteria that are constantly competing for resources.
Right, the gut microbiome and all that.
Exactly. Yet their collective interaction is what sustains the autopoietic network of your body. So in the global system, the friction, the trade, the information flow, even the conflicts, they're all part of the systemic metabolism.
So the issue isn't that the system isn't perfectly peaceful and coordinated.
Right. The issue is how the system responds to internal damage.
And that connects perfectly to the next major scientific claim in point 3, because the text argues that since the world is a closed autopoietic system, there are ironclad physical consequences to how we manage that internal friction.
The text is very specific here.
It is. It reads, quote, "In the closed loop of the biosphere, the law of feedback and recursive causality applies. Violence against a part inevitably returns to the whole."
This is a direct application of second-order cybernetics. We really need to look closely at that phrase, recursive causality.
Because we are totally conditioned to think in terms of linear causality, right?
Yes. If event A causes event B.
The aggressor strikes the target, the timeline moves forward, the energy is expended, and the transaction is complete. Boom. Done.
Right. But in a closed, interconnected network, causality doesn't just stop at B.
It loops.
It loops. The change in B alters the surrounding environment, which then alters the conditions of C and D.
And eventually that folds back and alters the fundamental state of A.
Exactly. In cybernetics, this is known as a feedback loop.
And a lot of historical analysis just treats these feedback loops as, like, political blowback, unintended consequences.
Right.
But the Manifesto is framing this as a physical law, like thermodynamics within a closed biosphere.
Well, because the Earth is materially closed, I mean, with the exception of solar radiation coming in and heat radiating out, we do not have an external environment to just absorb our systemic waste.
Whether that waste is ecological or political.
Exactly. If you inflict massive violence on a region to secure resources, you aren't just damaging that region.
You're destroying local ecological structures, you're displacing populations.
You're destroying agricultural capacity. And let's trace that recursive loop, practically.
Okay, that's it.
Those displaced populations, they have to migrate. That places immense strain on the infrastructure of neighboring regions.
Which then triggers reactionary political movements, right? Economic protectionism, the collapse of supply chains.
Yes. So the nation that initiated the violence in the first place, just to secure its own stability.
It suddenly finds its global markets shrinking, its borders are under pressure, its domestic politics get radicalized by the very instability it exported.
The violence boomerangs.
Is the manifesto basically saying that using violence in a closed biosphere is it's like poisoning the water in a fish tank while you're still swimming inside it?
That is precisely what it's saying.
Like, sure, you killed the other fish, but now you have to breathe the poison.
Right. And the manifesto specifically states this. The translation says, inflicting pain on another is a wound inflicted on oneself. The security of one cannot be built on the vulnerability of another.
Okay, but I want to step in and challenge this premise structurally.
Go for it.
Because if you're listening and you know your history, if we look at the broad sweep of human history, zero-sum extraction has arguably been the most successful political strategy for empire building.
It certainly appears that way.
I mean, look at the Roman Empire, or the Mongol Empire,
Mm.
or the colonial powers of the 18th and 19th centuries. They absolutely built their security and their immense wealth on the severe vulnerability of others.
Oh, without a doubt.
They extracted resources, they enslaved populations, and they exported all their violence to the periphery. And for hundreds of years, it worked. The metropole thrived while the colony suffered.
Right.
So how does the manifesto reconcile the historical success of violent empire building with this supposed hard law of recursive causality?
It's a critical challenge, and the answer really lies in the temporal scale of the feedback loop.
The temporal scale, meaning how long it takes for the loop to close.
Exactly. Historically, empires were operating in a world where the speed of information, trade, and ecological feedback was incredibly slow.
Right. It took months just to sail across the ocean.
So the closed loop of the biosphere was large enough, and human impact was relatively small enough, that an empire could externalize its violence. And it might take a century or more for the recursive causality to actually hit the metropole.
Wow. So it looked like linear causality simply because the people who initiated the violence died before the loop closed.
Precisely. They outran the consequences.
They pushed the ecological exhaustion and the political trauma to the geographic edges.
But even then, if you look closely, the laws of complexity eventually caught up.
Soil depletion.
Yes, overextension of military logistics and the inevitable integration of traumatized frontier populations. That all eventually hollowed out those empires from the inside.
But what the manifesto is signaling is that in our current era, with hyperglobalization, the loop has violently contracted.
We don't have centuries anymore.
We barely have weeks.
Right. Supply chains today are optimized to the millisecond. Financial markets are incredibly deeply coupled.
Yeah, a kinetic conflict in a vital shipping lane instantly causes energy spikes globally.
Which triggers inflation.
Which then topples governments on the other side of the planet within months.
The delay in recursive causality has completely vanished.
That makes the text's assertion incredibly pragmatic. The security of one cannot be built on the vulnerability of another.
Because in a highly coupled system, making your neighbor vulnerable doesn't make you safe. It makes your entire region volatile.
Right. If your neighbor's agricultural sector collapses due to conflict, your own food prices skyrocket, and your own political stability is suddenly threatened.
It completely invalidates the traditional doctrine of deterrence.
Wait, really? How?
Because deterrence is built entirely on creating vulnerability in your opponent.
Pointing enough weapons at a rival to make them terrified and insecure.
Right. But systems theory dictates that if you do that, you have just injected massive volatility into the network that you rely on to survive.
True systemic security requires the resilience of every node in the network, which requires a fundamental shift in how we conceptualize global interaction entirely. If we can't secure ourselves through zero-sum extraction, and if violence mathematically boomerangs, how do we actually construct a functional system?
Well, point 3 addresses this directly.
It says, quote, "We realize the reality of non-zero-sum games. In a globalized world, the gain of one is possible only with the gain of the whole."
So now we are moving from cybernetics into game theory.
Right.
The manifesto is arguing that we are collectively misdiagnosing the mathematical reality of our own environment.
I think most people probably understand the basic premise of a zero-sum game, right, where one person's gain requires another person's loss.
Like poker. If I win $10, you lose $10.
But the application of non-zero-sum dynamics to modern geopolitics, that's complex. We aren't just talking about basic trade where both parties walk away a little richer.
No, we are talking about deep structural interdependencies. Scenarios where my survival is literally contingent on your success.
Okay, can we look at an example?
Sure. Let's look at global pandemic response or the energy transition. These are textbook non-zero-sum scenarios.
Right.
In a zero-sum mindset, a nation might hoard medical supplies or intellectual property for a vaccine.
Prioritizing its own citizens while the rest of the world struggles, because they believe they're winning the game of national security.
But again, the biosphere is a closed loop.
So the virus circulates in the unvaccinated populations.
It mutates into a much more virulent strain that evades the original vaccine.
And it breaches the borders of the hoarding nation.
Exactly. The hoarding nation experiences a massive systemic loss because it failed to recognize the non-zero-sum reality.
The only mathematical way to secure your own population was to secure the global population.
The gain of one is possible only with the gain of the whole. This applies to carbon emissions, ocean acidification, nuclear proliferation.
You cannot have a localized victory in a globalized biosphere.
You really can't.
And the manifesto takes this game-theoretic mathematical reality and elevates it into an even broader strategic framework.
Yes, the infinite game.
Right. The text says, "We view life as an infinite game. The goal is not to defeat others, as in war, but to continue the game of life."
This is a direct reference to the work of philosopher James Carse. He famously delineated the difference between finite and infinite games.
Okay, break that down for us. What is a finite game?
A finite game, like chess or football or traditional warfare.
They have defined boundaries.
Agreed upon rules, known players, and most importantly, a specific objective to win and end the game.
You play to reach the victory condition. You play to bring about a conclusion.
Exactly, but an infinite game. It has fluid rules, it has known and unknown players, and its sole objective is to perpetuate play.
You do not play an infinite game to win.
No, you play to ensure the game continues.
Wow.
Carse argued that many of the catastrophes in human history occur because we try to play infinite games, like culture or diplomacy or survival.
With finite strategies.
Yeah.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because that shifts the entire paradigm. If the goal isn't to win, but to keep the system running, it completely redefines what we consider a failed political negotiation or a weak strategic posture.
Oh, so?
Well, in a finite game, compromise is a weakness.
Right.
Right? It means you are giving up ground on your way to total victory.
True.
But in an infinite game, compromise is the primary mechanism of system maintenance.
Yes, because your opponent in an infinite game is not an obstacle to be destroyed.
They're a required partner.
Exactly. They're a required partner in the continuation of play. Let's look at war. If you deploy a finite strategy and totally crush your geopolitical rival,
Destroying their economy, devastating their infrastructure.
you haven't won.
You've merely created a massive vacuum of instability, a breeding ground for extremism, a humanitarian catastrophe that will inevitably drag your own nation into decades of conflict.
You didn't win the game. You broke the board.
Oh, man, that is a powerful way to put it. So war is treating human existence like a game of Monopoly. The goal is to bankrupt everyone else until you're the only one left on the board.
But the manifesto is arguing life is actually more like trying to keep a rally going in tennis.
Yes. If you smash the ball so hard the other person can't hit it back, the rally dies.
Yeah.
You didn't win, you just stopped the game.
That is a perfect analogy.
A geopolitical infinite game strategy means consciously investing in the resilience of your competitors, because their collapse threatens the autopoietic network you both rely on.
And, I mean, it sounds so counterintuitive to the human ego. The ego loves the finality of a finite victory.
Of course, we love a clear winner and loser.
But mathematically, it is the only viable strategy in a closed-loop complex system.
And the authors of the Manifesto clearly understand that this is a radical cognitive shift.
Yeah.
They know that proposing an infinite game framework requires a deep rewiring of how human beings perceive their own identity in relation to the world.
Which is exactly why the final sentence of point 3 synthesizes 4 massive concepts to ground this systemic argument.
Let me read that final sentence. It says, "We share the philosophy of Ubuntu, the principle of interbeing, an understanding of the butterfly effect. Small actions in a complex system can have global consequences, and modern Earth system science, which concerns the intuition of the Gaia hypothesis. Earth is a single, self-regulating system that maintains the conditions for life, and we are its functional part."
There is so much packed into that one sentence.
Now, let's unpack the mechanics of each of these, because they are not just poetic flourishes.
No, not at all. They are the phenomenological and biological proofs of the systemic principle.
Okay, let's start with Ubuntu and interbeing.
Mm.
I think it is crucial we don't treat these merely as, like, spiritual platitudes. How do these ancient philosophies actually map to the hard math of network science we've been discussing?
Well, Ubuntu is a Southern African philosophy that posits basically, I am because we are.
Okay.
It is the assertion that human identity is not isolated. A person is only a person through other people.
Right, and interbeing.
Interbeing is a concept articulated by the Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh. It argues that nothing exists independently.
Can you give an example?
Sure. He used the example of a flower. A flower is made entirely of non-flower elements: sunlight, soil, water, time.
If you remove the non-flower elements, there is no flower.
Exactly.
So in the language of complex networks, Ubuntu and interbeing are basically descriptions of node dependency and scale-free networks.
Precisely. Network theory shows us that nodes, meaning individuals, derive their properties, their resilience, and their very function from the edges, the connections they share with other nodes.
If you isolate a node in a complex network, it degrades.
The philosophical realization of interbeing is the cognitive prerequisite for playing the infinite game.
Meaning, you literally cannot sustainably execute non-zero-sum strategies if you falsely believe your identity and survival are distinct from the network.
Right, you have to internalize the network reality first.
Okay, so the text establishes the network reality of human identity. Then it moves to the physical dynamics of that network, the butterfly effect.
Which originates in chaos theory and nonlinear dynamics. It was heavily researched by the meteorologist Edward Lorenz.
Right, in the 1960s, I think.
Yes. Lorenz discovered that in deterministic nonlinear systems, a minuscule variation in the initial conditions can lead to vastly divergent outcomes.
The classic example is the butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil, altering the atmospheric pressure just enough to eventually spawn a tornado in Texas.
Exactly.
But how does the mathematics of nonlinear dynamics apply to human nonviolence?
It proves that in a highly coupled autopoietic system, the magnitude of an action does not limit the magnitude of its systemic impact.
Wait, really? Say that again?
A localized act of violence or a localized act of systemic repair does not remain localized. Because the system is constantly adapting and feeding back on itself, a micro-action can scale logarithmically.
So the choice of a local community to resolve a resource dispute without violence isn't just a local victory.
No. It actually prevents the generation of a violent feedback loop that could have drawn in regional militias.
Which could have triggered international sanctions.
And disrupted global commodity markets. By maintaining local homeostasis, they are stabilizing the macro system.
It's all connected. Which brings us to the ultimate macro system, and maybe the most scientifically rigorous yet misunderstood concept in this entire paragraph.
Earth system science and the Gaia hypothesis.
Right. The Manifesto states that Earth system science confirms the intuition of the Gaia hypothesis. Now, I know the Gaia hypothesis was proposed by James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis in the 70s.
Yes, it was.
But is it risky for a formal manifesto to mix a poetic concept like Gaia with hard Earth system science? Because it faced a lot of resistance from the scientific establishment initially. Some people viewed it as this neo-pagan idea that the Earth was a sentient goddess.
Right, but Lovelock and Margulis were not arguing for planetary consciousness. They were analyzing atmospheric chemistry.
Oh, really? Okay, what was the actual biological mechanism they were proposing?
Well, Lovelock noticed that the Earth's atmosphere is in a state of profound chemical disequilibrium.
What does that mean?
We have highly reactive gases like oxygen and methane coexisting in steady concentrations. Chemically speaking, they should react and deplete each other, but they don't.
They stay stable.
Yes. The atmosphere remains stable, maintaining the exact temperature and chemical composition required for life. even as the sun's luminosity has increased by 30% over the last few billion years.
Oh, wow. So if the Earth were just a dead rock, the ocean should have boiled away by now.
Exactly. The Gaia hypothesis argues that the entire biosphere, the plants, the oceans, the microorganisms, interacts with the inorganic environment to form a single, self-regulating cybernetic system.
A self-regulating system.
Right. When the planet gets too hot, biological processes accelerate to draw down carbon. Or oceanic phytoplankton release dimethyl sulfide to seed clouds and increase the Earth's albedo.
Reflecting sunlight back into space and cooling the planet.
Exactly.
The biosphere acts like a planetary thermostat. It actively maintains its own habitability.
And modern Earth system science, studying biogeochemical cycles, ocean currents, carbon sinks, it has largely validated this model. The Earth operates as a unified autopoietic system.
But here is where point 3 delivers its most profound and arguably its most radical systemic claim.
This raises an important question, yes.
It states that Earth is a self-regulating system, and we are its functional part.
That phrasing, we are its functional part, it is absolutely critical.
It is the rejection of the most pervasive cliché in modern environmentalism, isn't it?
The idea that humanity is a virus.
Yes. We frequently hear that human civilization is a cancer on the Earth, a pathogen that the planet would be better off without.
Or, conversely, we hear the technocratic view that the Earth is just a dead sandbox for us to exploit.
Right, but the Manifesto rejects both.
It does. By stating we are a functional part of the Gaia system, it is arguing that human consciousness and human society are emergent properties of the planet's own regulatory framework.
We aren't alien invaders. We are the system's own evolution. So, if the phytoplankton act as the cloud seeding mechanism and the forests act as the carbon regulating mechanism, is the systemic function of humanity?
Well, in a cybernetic framework, we are the sensory organs and the feedback loops.
The sensory organs.
Yes. Through human science, data collection, and global communication, the Earth system has basically achieved a level of self-awareness.
We can measure the ozone layer, we can model the climate, we can track biodiversity.
But right, we are the planetary telemetry.
Wow, we are the telemetry.
Exactly. But a cybernetic system can only maintain homeostasis if its feedback mechanisms are accurately reading the environment and transmitting that data to trigger the right responses.
So when we engage in zero-sum warfare,
or when we extract resources violently without regard for the ecological network,
we are effectively severing our own sensory nerves.
We are blinding the system to its own collapse.
So if we look at the entire scope of point 3, the Manifesto's argument for peace isn't just about reducing human suffering, as vital as that obviously is.
No, it's about planetary mechanics.
Right. If the world is a complex adaptive system, and if violence inherently boomerangs through recursive causality, then our current geopolitical paradigm is driving the system toward collapse.
It's an autoimmune response. When a part of the system attacks another part of the system, it degrades the autopoietic ability of the whole.
It's just systemic self-harm.
Yes. The Manifesto is arguing that nonviolence, playing the infinite game, and recognizing our structural interbeing. These are the necessary cybernetic corrections to keep the Earth system viable.
It is just an incredible intellectual maneuver, taking the softest, most idealized concept we have, world peace, and anchoring it to the hardest physics of complex systems in planetary biology.
It really demands that we stop treating human behavior as something separate from the physical laws of the universe.
And it leaves us with this stark mathematical reality. We either align our social and political structures with the autopoietic nature of the biosphere, or the system will adapt in ways that no longer support our presence within it.
It's adapt or perish, but at a systemic level.
Well, this has been an immense amount of material to process.
It really has.
But I think it fundamentally alters how we view our daily interactions. We usually like to leave you, the listener, with a final thought, something to contextualize the deep dive.
And I think what's fascinating here is how this applies to the individual.
Right.
If the butterfly effect is mathematically sound within nonlinear systems, and if we are a functional sensory part of this Earth system, then our individual agency is vastly more powerful than a mechanistic worldview allows us to believe.
So every time you reject a zero-sum interaction, whether that's in local politics, in your workplace, or in your community,
You are injecting stabilizing feedback into the global network.
You are maintaining the telemetry. You are choosing to keep the infinite game going, rather than breaking the board for a temporary isolated victory.
Because according to the law of interconnection, there are no isolated victories. What you do to the nodes around you, you are mathematically and systemically doing to the entire world.
It totally redefines the phrase, think globally, act locally, not as an environmental slogan, but as a literal description of recursive physics.
Exactly.
Well, thank you for joining us on this intense exploration of Point 3, the Peaceful World Manifesto. We hope this deep dive has provided a new structural lens for understanding the absolute necessity of coexistence. We will see you next time.